I just wanted to welcome all of you today to this special event, which is more than just a film screening. It is a film screening. We're very lucky here to have the filmmaker Asumang, who came to us from Germany a couple of days ago for her 2 U.S. premieres of the film Roots Germania. I like to think of it that way, 2 U.S. premieres, because she actually showed the film last night in Indianapolis, and it went over very well, so I hope that we will enjoy this here in Bloomington. But in asking ourselves, about Afro-German relations and Afro-German identity, we wanted to do more than this because we have quite a few people on this campus who are doing interesting work in these directions. And I have today 2 colleagues who are going to be talking and helping us to contextualize a little bit this longer history of, as I said, relations between Germany and Africa. And the first of these colleagues is Michelle Moyd, who is an assistant professor of African history here at IUB, and she received her PhD from Cornell University in August of 2008. She is currently working on her first book, which is tentatively entitled Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest, and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa, 1890 to 1918. Michelle.
Okay, I'm not used to working with a mic, so hopefully I won't do anything crazy with it. But I wanted to thank Breger for inviting me to participate in this opportunity, and also to Asumang for making this provocative and groundbreaking film, and for visiting us here at IUB. This is a really great opportunity for me, especially given my research interests. Rather than attempting to summarize the historical relationship between Germany and Africa in 8 to 10 minutes or whatever I thought I would just try to use some images to highlight some of the key moments that preceded Asumang's experience as she depicts it in Roots Germania. And so this first image I will talk about for a few minutes, and after that I'll show you a series of images that I think will pinpoint some of the questions and issues that are most important for us to consider today. German involvement on the African continent reaches at least as far back as the late 1600s, when beginning in 1683, Elector Friedrich Wilhelm of Brandenburg commissioned the construction of a major fortress complex known as Groß-Friedrichsburg that stretched over some 50 kilometers of the Gold Coast, today's Ghana. This decision went hand in hand with the conception and acquisition of a small navy, which gave Friedrich Wilhelm the ability to project military power overseas and to thus begin participating in the international trading networks that had enriched other European nations in the preceding century. The Brandenburg Africa Company, founded to promote Brandenburg's economic interests overseas, operated out of the Groß-Friedrichsburg location for nearly 4 decades, achieving its so-called high point in 1686. The company never achieved the size or financial successes of its better established European rivals along the coast, and indeed was plagued with financial problems and mismanagement throughout its history. But it was nonetheless thoroughly enmeshed in the international trading networks and power dynamics of the period. The fort was finally taken over by the Dutch in 1724 after Friedrich Wilhelm's uninterested son and successor Friedrich III, ascended the throne. And then his grandson, Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia, sold the fort to the Dutch West India Company for 6,000 ducats in 1717. Despite the brevity of Brandenburg's involvement on the West African coast, it is worth noting that the company and its ships were deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade for as long as it occupied Groß-Friedrichsburg and likely beyond. Now this leads to a key point I want to make, which is that until the late 1990s, one of the hallmarks of scholarship on German colonialism and the minimal public knowledge of them was that it tended to dismiss the German colonial projects as short and inconsequential, vis-a-vis the much more temporally and geographically extensive efforts of Great Britain and France. The German colonial era typically is described as running from about 1880 to 1918, but of course there were German explorers, missionaries, scientists, and companies present on the continent at least from the mid-1800s. None of these exercises were wholly peaceful, and in fact, explorers like Karl Peters unleashed violence that was remembered for generations around the Kilimanjaro region of East Africa. The colonial experience for most Africans under German rule included forced labor, few outlets for socioeconomic mobility, and punitive measures that could only have appeared arbitrary, abusive, and disproportionate to the population experiencing these things. During World War I, Germany's African colonies, especially East Africa, experienced what one historian has called the, quote, ultimate exploitation, their use as battlefields. The fact that Germany lost its colonies at the end of World War I also gave apologists for German colonialism a convenient way to argue that in fact Germany was a so-called model colonizer, and that its former subjects in Africa and elsewhere desperately wanted German colonialism back. What scholars have argued more recently, however, is quite simply that Germany's colonial past matters in at least three important ways. First, Germany was immersed in all of the same processes of human degradation and devaluation and exploitation that other slave trading and later colonizing powers were, and in this sense, the relative numbers involved don't seem to be the key issue. Germany derived symbolic and political capital from its status as a colonizer, even if it never made the country much money. The violence of colonialism went largely unspoken, except for 1905 to 1908, when German Southwest Africa and German East Africa experienced genocidal war, scorched earth tactics, and a so-called Hungerstrategie, or a strategy of famine, which made the news back at home and shaped German political discourse for a short moment. Secondly, Africans had been living in Germany for a very long time. Here again, the fact that they lived there in small numbers does not diminish the fact that they also lived through times of profound alienation and violence directed against them. The fact that Germans of African descent found ways to make a living, to build families, to find community, and to survive during the low points of Germany's 20th century history is a story worth telling, and I'm glad that Asumang gives us a piece of that today. As a sort of preface to the film, I'll now show you just a few images of blacks in Germany up to World War II. This painting on your left is one that you can see in the Deutsches Historisches Museum today in Berlin, and it's called Ein preußisches Liebesglück, was painted around 1890. And it's a representation of this man, Gustav Sabach-Elscher, depicted in his Imperial German military uniform. This man was the son of a Sudanese man who was brought to Germany in the 1840s to become a member of the Prussian military band, and this was one of the places that Africans had a small but steady presence from as early as the 1600s when the Brandenburg fortress was built. And he did marry a German woman, and they lived in Berlin, and they ran a cafe in Königs-Wusterhausen, which is a small a suburb outside of Berlin, which was also the seat of one of the homes of the Prussian ruling family. So this is one representation of an African in Germany. Next, a picture of a Cameroonian man who came to Germany around 1896, Martin de Boering, who also lived in Berlin and worked as a streetcar operator between the years of 1906 and 1920. So I like this picture a lot because it shows an African person working in Germany in a sort of very regular job, not in the entertainment industry, not in the Prussian military, but a sort of everyday job. Oops, that's how the I juxtaposed these two pictures to try and make a point about representation, and I'll come back to that at the very end of my remarks. What you see on the left is a propaganda poster that was used in the early 20s in the so-called Schwarze Schmuck campaign that translates roughly to the Black Disgrace. This was a campaign that was launched against soldiers who were occupying the Rhineland right after World War I, African colonial soldiers who were occupying the Rhineland after World War I. And as you can see, it's one of the most virulent forms of racist visual imagery that exists in German visual culture. There are many examples of this. This one obviously shows an African soldier as an oversexed and dangerous threat to white German women and obviously to the German nation as a whole. Juxtaposed with that, I have this image of a German colonial soldier from East Africa represented in a memoir that was published in 1922 by a former German colonial officer. And what I'm trying to show here is just sort of the poles of representation of Africans and people of African descent and of black masculinity. On the one side, you've got this sort of oversexed representative, and then this childlike representative, which are very common tropes in representation of Africans and their descendants. Okay, so here I'm jumping forward to 1938, and this picture shows members of the Deutschen Afrika-Schau, which was kind of a cultural descendant of what were called Völkerschauen in the imperial period. These were similar to expositions and that sort of thing that set up communities and villages of people that were meant to represent faraway places. This was one that existed during the Nazi period, interestingly, and just show you one of the people in this picture, this man, whose name is, well, his sort of stage name, I suppose, was Mohammed Hussein. He came to Germany around 1929 and made himself a career in this business as an entertainer, as an actor. He had been a colonial soldier before he came to Germany, and he was one of a very small number of ex-colonial soldiers who came to Germany and found other ways of making a living after World War I. This is Mohammed Hussein again, and this is kind of an interesting picture, a set of pictures of him. The one on the left is a picture of him in a costume, actually. That is not a real soldier's uniform. He played a soldier several times in different colonial films. On the right, a picture of him as he looked in 1941. And this was sort of an advertisement that he posted for himself in order to try and get work. Of course, during the National Socialist period, he and other Africans and people of African descent found their economic opportunities severely curtailed. And so he was advertising his various skills, including his acting skills, but also his language skills. Sadly, Mohammed Hussein was arrested by the Nazis later that year, and he died in Sachsenhausen 3 years later. So that was not an untypical story for people of African descent in Germany at that time. Now, I need to go back to one last picture. Should I have it out of order? Of course, there's a lot here that I'm leaving out, including the Nazi sterilization campaign against the Rhineland, so-called Rhineland bastards, in which some 400 Afro-Germans were arrested and sterilized starting in 1937 as part of Nazi racial policy. I've mentioned the Nazi successful efforts to squeeze Afro-Germans and Africans out of all possible ways of making a living. Internment, I've mentioned with the case of Mohammed Hussein, and later on adoption campaigns in the post-war period in which children of, again, children of African descent were systematically sent out of the country to be adopted by families, especially in the United States. So my last point on how Germany's colonial past matters is that, and there are surely many more than the three I've mentioned here, is that Africans occupy a space in the history of German visual culture, especially in advertising and marketing for chocolate and coffee, book illustrations, etc., that seems way out of proportion to the relatively small numbers of Africans who lived there up to World War II. And here, this is a very famous brand of chocolate, Sarati, which used this picture of the Sarati Moor for many decades to advertise their product. This one on the right, so this is sort of the colonial era one that lasted up until the 90s, I believe. This is the new one, which you can now find on Sarati chocolate. But interestingly, at least a few years ago when I was in Berlin, that image was the one that is still stamped on the chocolate itself. So this is the outside package. That image is still on the chocolate. So that's sort of my short historical story of the presence of Africans and their descendants in Germany since 1680-something, and hopefully I'll be able to pick up from here.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very enlightening. Our next speaker is my colleague in Germanic Studies, Claudia Breger, who is associate professor and also adjunct in communication and culture and gender studies. Claudia's research and teaching focus on 20th and 21st century literature, film, and culture, with an emphasis on the interrelations of gender, sexuality, and race, as well as literary, media, and cultural theory. Her books include Szenarien kopfloser Herrschaft, which is scenarios of headless rule, beheaded authority, okay, even better. I hope you have a nice one for this too. And Ortlosigkeit des Fremden.
That's untranslatable.
Well, I like to say the placelessness of the foreign, but, you know, it's, yes, okay, that's good enough. And her current manuscript addresses performance and narrative in Germany's contemporary global culture.
Thank you for organizing, and thank you for being here. This is actually, in a way, the introduction would not have been necessary. This is not a research talk or anything to that effect. I'm just going to try to, in fact, pick up where Michelle left us and give a little more of a contemporary contextualization of the film to ease access, especially for those of you who are not in German studies or don't have much background in that respect. So I'm just going to start very briefly. I don't have any images either. It's just going to be words here. Start with talking very, very briefly about concepts of German identity in general, because that is extremely important. Those of you in German studies know probably about the jus sanguinis, and that has basically been the concept that governs German citizenship legislation, has been doing so until 2000, when there was finally a reform. But until 2000, all through the 20th century, German citizenship has been based on descent, to the effect that basically children of immigrants born in the country in the third or even fourth generation are still foreigners. And that is sort of, on the one hand, a very important socio-economic and political factor for immigration in Germany, but it is also crucial in that concepts of identity have been very much shaped by that legacy, also beyond the legal realm, to the effect of basically a lot of Afro-Germans who have German citizenship, because they are biracial and sort of like one of the parents is from Germany, is German. Even German, in terms of legal belonging, Germans are not generally seen as German in that tradition because of these consequences of basing citizenship and identity on descent and implicitly racializing these categories. And that, was not only true through the Nazi era that we just heard about, but also the post-war period, when on the one hand race became taboo in some respects. Sort of after the Holocaust, it was not to be talked about any longer, but that was not actually, in all respects, practically the case at all. There was, as Fatima Al-Tayyib has put it, a schizophrenic configuration of denial and obsession with race in post-war Germany that has shaped the following generations of Afro-Germans as well as immigrants. And from all of that basically results a very specific kind of invisibility when it comes to Afro-Germans that Michelle Wright has described in Hegelian terms as the German black is not seen as an other from within, but an other from without, basically meaning that it is, for many Germans up to this day, almost impossible to imagine black people as German, because it is so deeply rooted, this racialized notion of belonging, that people constantly get seen as foreigners without any, having any foreign background often, that is sort of like almost impossible to imagine people as black and German at the same time. A little bit more concrete post-war histories, what happened after the war. About 10% of the so-called occupation children after World War II were biracial, usually an African-American father and a white German mother, and these kids became the target of yet another of these horrible campaigns about miscegenation, again, despite the fact that in some respects race had now been declared taboo, but nonetheless, we already heard about the adoption campaigns of getting the kids out of the country, and also beyond that, basically debates about whether the climate would be good for them in Germany, and of course, always with this idea they should go back, in quotation mark, to their father's country, of course, where they had never been because they were born in Germany, but sort of this imagination of them not belonging certainly persisted. Most of these children then grew up in exclusively white contexts, isolated from any other children with a similar background, often also without their birth mothers, not only the birth fathers. Marriages were not always possible, not only after World War II, but also in the next generation. Later on, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was quite a few children born to usually, again, white German mothers, and fathers with an African background who had come to Germany as either students or workers, contract workers in the East, so-called guest workers in the West. And also in that generation, again, most of these kids did actually not grow up with both parents, and often also not with their birth mother, but as adopted children, foster care, and of course, with grandparents sometimes. So there is basically two generations who grew up in these almost exclusively white contexts until more recently broader scale immigration from different African countries and other people from the African diaspora has led to increased visibility of larger African diaspora communities in at least some German cities. That notion of diaspora is also maybe worth a brief remark. Since the mid-80s, first of all, Afro-Germans have organized politically also coined that notion of Afro-German at the time, as the story goes, and not just mythically, but people have been debating the significance of that particular event. But basically, Audre Lorde was in Berlin and visiting and talking to people, talking to black German women, and there was, the coinage of that notion, Afro-German, in analogy to Afro-American at the time. And basically, also from there on, people started to develop notions of the African diaspora for the German context. And of course, the peculiarity that I just mentioned is that for those generations, there was pretty much an absence of shared memory due to most people having grown up in very white contexts. And in that sense, more recent research about African diaspora in the German context usually stresses that when we apply this notion, we have to specifically underline things which have actually been said about those concepts more generally recently, namely that diaspora is not simply an orientation towards a given homeland, but an active process of building identity across differences in like ways that are very different for different geographical contexts. And finally, to contextualize what we're going to see in a minute, post-unification, German society, 1990 and after. First of all, it is important to keep in mind that neo-Nazis existed both in the GDR and in the West in the 1980s. They did not just simply come out of nowhere in 1990, but nonetheless it is very visibly and more widespread. The presence became, after unification, basically there was a rise in hate crimes, violence, not exclusively in the former East, but certainly, more so in the former East than in the West. And hate crime statistics, until I think last year, there was sort of someone said, well, they went down for the first time, but basically for years and years, the numbers of hate crimes just kept growing. So it's not something that was confined to just a few years after unification, but actually has been a very gruesome, presence in German society ever since 1990. With the violence directed disproportionately at people of African background. Not exclusively, but most of those who died, and I think we'll hear about that in the film as well, were of African or biracial background. And also importantly, it's not just, it would be too easy to say this is a few neo-Nazis who are being violent, but there is actually a very broad background of more or less diffuse racist and even larger anti-foreigner, in quotation marks, ressentiments. I'm quoting this one statistic that's a very recent one from the Bielefeld Institute that has been doing a lot of research on various attitudes of that kind, that more than half of the German population share or agree, or at least somewhat agree with sentences like there are too many foreigners in Germany. So you basically see that you have a spectrum of, on the one hand, people who are violently racist, but also a lot of people who are sort of who share some of those attitudes. And there has been a lot of debate, obviously, about the genealogies of violence, and the film contributes to that debate, and I hope we can talk some more about that. But basically, just again to contextualize sort of the way the debate has been going, on the one hand, we obviously, when we want to try to explain this, have to take into account that in the former East, there has been a lot of disorientation, of social marginalization, people simply losing their jobs and so forth, and that has certainly contributed to those higher numbers of hate crime in the East. But also, and people have been discussing specifically, like, sort of, is it the fault of the GDR, the authoritarian legacies of the GDR, and those factors are certainly also to be considered. But at the same time, I think we need to talk about both Germany's failure to work through the legacy of the Nazi state, but also beyond that, the legacy of racism in German society that had been present very much in the earlier 20th century. If we do not address those aspects of racism, there's probably no way of really understanding what has been going on there. And again, I think the film makes a very important contribution to these questions, and we should watch it.
Thank you, Claudia, for that. I think that brings us all, especially those of you who are not coming from Germanic studies or taking history with Michel Moyd. You get a little bit more of a sense of how this has been building over years and decades, centuries even. To make this event even possible, to have Asumang here, I just wanted to mention the people who have contributed to this before I introduce Mo herself. And again, the film brings a lot of interests together, and these include the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of Multicultural Initiatives, West European Studies, the Black Cinema Center Archive here on campus, the Institute of German Studies, African Studies, the Americas Series, and Communication and Culture. And in addition to that, this would not be possible without our partnership with IUPUI and the German consulate in Chicago. So it really takes a lot of people, I think, to create an event like this and to make this possible. Now, Mo Asumang, I don't want to say too much about her because you are going to meet her twice today. You're going to meet her once here in this room in 2 seconds, and you're going to meet her for about 75 minutes in her film. So I'd just like to, rather than say too much, invite her up here to say hello.